how did I get here? Ananias stood in the gate of the sun, and the question came to him. How did I get here? He looked down the long, straight thoroughfare through the heart of Damascus, and he looked at the crowds of people in the street, and the horses and the camels and the donkeys going down the broad center lane. And for the first time since he had converted to the way, and that seemed like a lifetime ago already, but for the first time since converting to the way, he felt like an alien in his own city, a stranger among his own people. And he stood there and he felt the sweat trickling down his back, and he knew that it wasn't entirely due to the sun overhead. And he asked himself again, how did I get here? And the answer each time was deceptively simple. He got here because God had sent him. And he reminded himself of this. Yes, God sent me. And he began to walk down this street called Straight, putting one foot in front of the other and trying not to think about what might be waiting for him at his destination, because he'd heard stories about this man. And he walked. Straight Street was a Roman road that cut like a knife through the heart of Damascus. It was almost 100 feet wide. It was the only straight street in town. It was divided into 3 lanes, a very broad lane in the middle for animal and vehicle traffic, and then a walking lane on each side. And on each side there were these beautiful double colonnades that the Romans had built. And the street stretched on for a mile, more or less, to the gate in the western wall. It might help you visualize how long that is. It's like from here to Family Dollar. It's a long street. And near the far end, there was an amphitheater, which any decent Roman city would have had. And in between, there were businesses and residences along the street, and there were public and government buildings, and always people bustling around. And as he walked, he could feel that the pavement was already warm beneath his feet, and in the air there was this constant hum of noise. It was people talking, doing business. It was people just having conversations. There were horses snickering and disdain for everything that was going on around them, and there were camels snorting, goats and sheep bleating. It was a constant drum of noise, and if all that was an assault on the ears, then the natural byproducts of all those animals and humans together sort of blended together as well. It was an assault on the nose. And that too hung in the air. Ananias knew this scene very well. He had been here many, many times, but this was the first time that he actually looked at it, that he felt it, that he smelled it and felt like he didn't belong here. As he walked down the street, every instinct, every fiber in his body said to cut and run. Every reasonable impulse he had said that this mission was foolish at best and dangerous at worst, and he had no business doing it. And yet there was that voice. Go to the house of Judas, it said. Find a man from Tarsus named Saul. So he kept going. And he found the house, and he announced that he was here to deliver a message, and nobody seemed inclined to turn him away. They actually let him in, and there was a part of him, at least, a small part, that regretted it. Because there was a small part of him that had been hoping at the end that he would get turned away and he would not have to carry out his mission. But they let him in. And he silently cursed his luck as the servant led him into this darkened room where a figure lay on the bed. Saul of Tarsus, persecutor of wayward Jews, killer of converts to the way, the sect that had sprung up in the wake of Jesus Christ. Saul of Tarsus was a man whose reputation for terror in Jerusalem had preceded him to Damascus, some 135 miles away. No follower of the way would want to cross this man's path. And yet here Ananias was, in the same room. Not because he had been discovered, not because he had been pursued or arrested, but because he was presenting himself like a sheep walking up to the altar to be slaughtered. And Ananias stood there for a moment or two in the doorway, and then he gathered up his wits and his courage, and he walked up to the man on the bed, and Saul turned to him, and of course he couldn't see. And that's when Ananias realized that he was blind. Saul was blind. He was helpless. And Ananias at that moment realized he could still bolt from the room and run far away, and Saul would never know who it was that had been there. Instead, he walked up to Saul and he laid hands on him. And he said, "Saul, brother, the Lord, Jesus, who appeared to you on the road, has sent me so that you might see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Immediately, Luke tells us that the scale-like things on his eyes fell away and Saul could see. He got out of bed and he was baptized, and soon enough, this persecutor of Christians was himself preaching the good news in the synagogues of Damascus. And this happened because one man, Ananias, listened to the Lord. He went fishing in this house on Straight Street. Went fishing for an unlikely man in an unlikely place. And he found him and brought him to Christ. It's a story that is told and retold many, many times throughout the history of the church. The names change, the places change, the serial numbers get filed off. But it's the same story. Jesus sends somebody to an unlikely place to reach out to an unlikely person and share with them an unlikely message. That for all of their imperfections and all of their faults and sins, Jesus loves them. Jesus loved them enough to die for them. And then Jesus rose to triumph over death. The passage we heard earlier from John's Gospel, which was sort of an epilogue to the story of Thomas. It might not seem like it, But it's a similar story. You recall the particulars. The disciples, 7 of the disciples anyway, they're out fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Another name for the Sea of Tiberias. And they're having no luck. And then this figure appears, this Jesus, appears on the shoreline and says, "You having any luck, guys?" And of course they say no. Jesus tells them to cast their nets out on the right side of the boat. Now there's lots of interesting symbolism you could read into that, if you're into that kind of thing, but I'm just going to go for the simplest explanation. The type of nets, I've learned, the types of nets that they used in the Sea of Galilee were always cast on the left side of the boat. Apparently it was easier for men to work the nets reaching off to their left instead of their right. And that's just how they did it. And then Jesus comes along and he says, "Cast them off to the right." Jesus comes along and says, "You've been doing this and it's not working. Do this." And it's awkward. And it's not the way you've done things before. But do this and see what happens. And they do. And all of a sudden they've got more fish than they can handle. And more than that, they've got Jesus waiting for them on the shore to cook up the fish. How often do you suppose it happens that, you have a chance to go fishing and to come back to shore and have Jesus there tending a charcoal fire? Maybe wearing a kiss the cook apron. It's a pretty awesome experience for them. Once they decided to take that chance, to do that thing that wasn't what they always used to do. That thing that felt kind of awkward. They had success. Now, at the risk of drawing lessons from, just 2 particular passages, I think the lessons we might draw from these are that to live a Christian life in many ways means to live an uncomfortable life. Because it's a life where we forego doing the safe thing in favor of doing the right thing. It's a life where we actually live what we learn in church. It's a life where we live what we learned in Sunday school or confirmation class or Bible study. Because learning is great, but learning is not a substitute for doing. Knowing that we should love our neighbor is a world away from actually, loving our neighbor. It's a world away from actually helping those who need help and comforting those who need comfort and guiding those who are in need of direction. Doing this can be uncomfortable. It's not what we've always done, and it's not with people we've always associated with. But we have been commissioned by Jesus Christ to actually reach out to the world with the good news. And reaching out to the world starts with reaching out to the people around us, to the world around us. And we're called to make converts. And then we're called to make disciples. The mission statement of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Because we know the world doesn't change until we change the people. And the people don't change until they have Jesus. We struggle with that. Here's a simple thing. Might still be uncomfortable, but it's simple. How many of us know somebody that doesn't go to church? See you. You know people that don't go to church? Well, we all know them, but do we know how many of those people might actually come to church or come to a church event if they were invited? Extending that invitation can be awkward. It can be really uncomfortable. But we actually could do it if we wanted to take that chance. This conference I was at on Friday, I learned about a study from the Barna Research Group. I'm going to back up first. Do you know, pop quiz, out of all the ways that a person might end up coming to church, particular church, what do you suppose is the most likely way to get them in the door? It's an invitation from Fran. You know Fran? Friend, relative, acquaintance, neighbor. Far and away, an invitation to church from one of those people, maybe more of those people, is what gets people in the door. It's not advertising. It's not, a door-to-door campaign. It's an invitation from Fran. So the Barna Research Group did a study. It was a study on evangelism, but part of the study focused on inviting people to church. And they were specifically, in this one instance, they were studying the United Methodist denomination. And they were studying how people make that first connection to an unchurched or a dechurched person. Do you know how often a person in the United Methodist Church invites somebody else who doesn't come to church? Do you know how often that happens? According to the Barna Research Group, the average United Methodist invites someone to come to their church every 38 years. So if you've invited somebody more than once since Jimmy Carter was elected, you're ahead of the game. Think about that. Every 38 years. What goes on here that we don't want to share with people? We have the best news in town. Jesus Christ is here for them. That He died for them. That He saved them. We want to keep that to ourselves. We're called to do uncomfortable things. And we've talked about, previous weeks, we've talked about one of those things is to actually serve people, to go out and help them, to talk to them, to do all of these different things that meet their needs. But another uncomfortable thing is to step outside of our comfort zone and jettison that social norm of not talking about church or religion and inviting people just to come and see. We're not asking you to come and make a commitment. We're just, come and see. See what it's about. See how I spend an hour on Sunday morning. It's an awkward thing to do for many of us, but it is so important. And I can speak about that from experience. That's how I ended up back in church. It's a long story for another time. But it happens. It only happens if we step outside of our comfort zone. Ananias, as a convert to the way, he was called to minister to a man who might very well have killed him if things had gone south. But he went to him anyway. And he became part of the story of one of the greatest evangelists in our history. So today, what stories do you think might be waiting to be told? I would start right here. When we step out of our comfort